Proposed changes to the American Studies curriculum. What the American Studies curriculum looks like now. In a standard American Studies class, you would expect to have the core curriculum to include the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, immigration, Native Americans, abolition, the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, the wage gap in the 1920s, organized crime, and prohibition. Though all these events are key to the foundation of the history of the United States, there are holes to be filled regarding women's rights and those of the LGBTQ+ community. A large portion of this class revolved around the Civil Rights Movement and the everlasting struggle of the African American community in the United States. We agree that this topic is extremely important to our history and vital to building an understanding of being an American. But African Americans were not alone in their struggle for equality. Women and members of the LGBTQ+ community faced oppression in the same time period. But these groups of people seem to be overlooked when it comes down to the curriculum. If you, as the Board of Education, believe that the foundation of an education, and the American Studies education in particular, is to provide students with a curriculum that contains a wide range of topics, all of which provide multiple lessons to viewing the world around them in order to represent different viewpoints, then you will believe that integrating the study of female and LGBTQ+ history is necessary to creating this educational balance. Cool.
During the 1950s and early 1960s, a woman's life course was limited in terms of what was considered socially acceptable. A woman was expected to be married by the time she was 22. Premarital sex was unacceptable and made a woman unfit for marriage. Divorce was difficult to obtain and ruined job opportunities as well as social reputations. Sex was not talked about, even amongst friends. Adultery was penalized by law. Birth control and abortion were illegal. Little to no information was available to girls and women about their bodies. Dress and body type were strictly dictated, conservative dress and a full figure. And finally, equal rights between men and women were not legalized. Growing up and living as a female in this time of our history was far from easy, and you must be wondering how we got to where we are today. Nearing the end of the 1960s and throughout the 1970s, the infamous sexual revolution took place. There was finally a push for American women demanding that they needed drastic changes in their lives, and surely enough, they started getting what they were asking for. In 1964, there was a Griswold v. Connecticut case regarding the right to privacy, and birth control was legalized. This was a major accomplishment for women because in the first time in their lives, they were able to control pregnancies. This allowed women to have sex without the fear of pregnancy and hold off on having children and pursue careers. Studies like Dr. Alfred Kinsey's Sexual Behavior of the Human Male and Sexual Behavior of the Human Female displayed information about the truths of what was happening behind closed doors and made people start talking about sex. There was also the new image of the single girl, promoted heavily by Helen Gurley Brown, who wrote the book Sex and the Single Girl. The single girl could have a successful occupation, have premarital sex, and empowered herself through her sexuality. With society changing, so did the law. The Civil Rights and Equal Pay Acts, as well as Title IX, giving female sports equal funding at universities. And in 1973, Our Bodies Ourselves was published, giving women readily available information about their bodies. And in 1973, abortion was finally legalized, further giving women control of their bodies and their futures. The sexual revolution transformed the restricted American woman into a free American woman. Societal norms are constantly changing, and in the 1980s, women's liberation took a turn for the worse. The country became more conservative as a whole, especially with Reagan in office. And after feeling like they had come so far, feminist leaders became discouraged. Reagan was definitely not a women's rights activist. He had no women in his cabinet, fought against abortion rights, opposed the Equal Rights Amendment, and cut or took away federal funding for female organizations. Written by Susan Faludi, Backlash dictates the backlash of the sexual revolution and how women were shoved backwards in their advancements. The growing media turned women into objectified sex symbols and in advertisements, movies, and TV, and unrealistic beauty expectations and body pressures for women were prevalent. And almost 40 years later, these conditions for women still exist today.
During the 1950s and early 60s, members of the LGBTQ+ community were considered abnormal and thus faced severe and physical consequences. Homosexuality was seen as a disease, and so those who were inflicted with this so-called disease were institutionalized and were given drugs, surgeries, and psychiatric evaluations to try to make them straight. There was no protection against this discrimination, so many homosexual people were susceptible to unemployment, physical abuse, and being social outcasts. In the 80s and 90s, LGBTQ+ members faced similar challenges, of which two stood out. In 1981, the first case of AIDS was discovered in the bloodstreams of 5 homosexual men. AIDS spread rapidly, particularly among gay men, and because of this, AIDS became known as a gay cancer, and the fear of the virus resulted in even more homophobia. Fortunately, scientific research found out that AIDS was a blood disease in the 1990s. This discovery, as well as Magic Johnson's diagnosis with HIV and his contributions to research, shed light on the fact that AIDS did not exclusively affect homosexuals. In addition to the AIDS epidemic, members of the LGBTQ+ community faced institutionalized discrimination like they did back in the 60s. The United States military has been one of the most progressive and forward-thinking institutions in this country, but in 1994, President Bill Clinton instituted the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. Don't Ask, Don't Tell stated that any non-straight persons would be restricted from joining the armed service, and anyone that was in the service and found out about their homosexuality would be dishonorably discharged from their branch. Before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the military was allowed to perform tests to see if its troops were homosexual, and if so, kick them out of the service. Don't Ask, Don't Tell simply stated that you could no longer ask, but if you found out someone was non-straight, they were to be discharged. Although a step in the right direction, Don't Ask, Don't Tell still oppressed members of the LGBTQ+ community who were in the military or those who wished to join. In 2011, all discriminatory acts against members of the military based on sexual orientation were deemed unconstitutional, although transgenders are still considered ineligible.
Reading short stories in class is a good outlet to this historical information. They are an engaging way for students to learn about the context, but also have a story to relate to.
You're Ugly Too, for example, is a story about societal expectations for women in the 1980s. The main character, Zoe, struggles with resisting gender roles and expectations of beauty, occupation, attitude, and marital status. There is a critical insight to the personal struggle of women during this time, and a double bind they fight between the sexual revolution and the backlash of the sexual revolution.
Reprise, another short story, is about gender roles for men. The main character, a male, comes face to face with confronting his homosexuality. At the time, gay men were considered molesters and perverts, and he was told that men should not be interested in other men. When everyone finds out about his relationship with another man, he is sent to a boarding school and a psychiatrist. The AIDS epidemic also comes into play. His family and community are extremely homophobic and cannot come to terms with his homosexuality.
Our curriculum is heavily based on the social issues of this country's history. The short stories You're Ugly Too and Reprise sparked the conversation of the social battle for women and the LGBTQ+ community. Most significant of this social history is the Civil Rights Movement and the various events that happened during the time, like the Vietnam War and the challenging of the establishment. The Civil Rights Movement is typically seen as a time when the African American community gained legal equality with the rest of the United States. This sparked other key events that paved the way for other minority groups in the USA. 1969 saw the Stonewall protests, and the sexual revolution marked a time of breaking down on gender roles and liberating women in society. These movements were born in the heart of the Civil Rights Movement, and these stories can further enhance our understanding of the Civil Rights Movement. We also briefly viewed gender roles when studying the 50s and 60s. The ideal American family is a working husband, housewife, and 2 children. These short stories would aid in deepening students' understanding of how hard these gender roles expectations were for many citizens, and how they would slowly be broken down. A core aspect of the class is not just studying the majority's history or just our history, but hearing the history of all people. LGBTQ+ rights and women's rights are key aspects of American history and should not be left out. They would provide a better learning experience for the Civil Rights Unit and provide a better understanding of American history because it doesn't exclude previously or underrepresented people of America, and deepen students' understanding of the class's key idea of answering the question of what does it mean to be an American. These stories help to build our understanding of what it means to be an American. Choosing not to teach this content is choosing not to represent an extremely large portion of our country in what is considered to be an American Studies class, and therefore only hurting students by limiting their ability to view the world through a larger and more accurate frame.
You're Ugly Too recognizes the overlooked personal struggle of American women fighting the urge to conform to America's label of the ideal woman versus striving to make their own decisions regardless of those expectations and objectifications.
Reprise informs us about gender expectations for men, the most prevalent being masculinity and the unbelievably harsh conditions of the LGBTQ+, and how the community progressed.
Avoiding the whole history of the sexual revolution and women's rights takes out 50% of our population's history and 50% of our class members' history as well. Presenting this context also benefits female students by educating them of the modern day media sexualization and objectification of women and gender roles in order to understand how to tackle these issues as modern day females. This story is also just as important for male students who need to learn about their counterparts in order to further aid them in their social advancements so women are not alone in their fight.
Here at New Trier, we host the Day of Silence to recognize those whose voices have been silenced because of how they sexually identify. A previously silenced LGBTQ+ community needs to be voiced in a class like American Studies, where social events in the United States can be discussed. Examples being the legalization of gay marriage by the Supreme Court in 2015, County Clerk Kim Davis refusing to sign a marriage license, and the recent issue of North Carolina not passing anti-discriminatory laws.
This is not just a history course, and these topics aren't just history lessons, but rather, they expose roots of our country that are relevant to how we live today.